So, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar. Just a quick note before we get started. We do ask that you keep your microphone muted and perhaps your video off as well during the session, just to minimize distractions for your fellow participants. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nick Maturo. I'm a project manager at ELAN, working on our Quebec Relations project. And before we go any further, I'd like to begin by recognizing that ELAN, and indeed the office space I'm speaking to you from, is located in Tiohtià:ke, which is the original name for Montreal in Kanien'kehá:ka, the language of the Mohawk, also known as Muniang, which is the Anishinaabe name given to the city by the Algonquin. Even though we're speaking to each other sort of remotely and not in the same physical space, I do want to begin by acknowledging that before we go any further. So with this in mind, I would like to welcome you all to our fourth Quebec Relations webinar for 2021. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, Quebec Relations, or QR for short, is an ELAN project that's first and foremost about helping artists and arts organizations access funding and other key resources offered by the government of Quebec. So today we're going to follow up on a webinar that we offered last year to teach you about navigating the Ministry of Education's Culture in the Schools program. So for those of you active with ELAN's Art Ed program or looking to work in the classroom, this is going to be a really great first step in learning how to make the most of culture in the schools. And rather than lead you through the presentation myself, I'll be handing things over shortly to somebody with firsthand experience with the program, Louise Campbell. Louise is a member of ELAN's own terrific Art Ed team, providing communications and artist support. Louise is also a Montreal-based musician with a diverse background, including work as a performer, improviser, composer, and community arts facilitator. And she is also an artist in the Culture in the Schools repertoire. And we're also very fortunate to have a couple of Art Ed artists who've graciously offered their time to speak with us today during a panel discussion starting about halfway through the webinar. First of all, we have Rob Lutz. Rob is a professional singer-songwriter with 8, maybe even more by now, albums and an extensive touring history in Canada, the US, and Europe. Rob has also offered songwriting and music workshops in schools since 2000, teaching songwriting and creativity to inspire, engage, and empower youth. I think Rob said he might be joining us a few minutes late, but if you're already here, welcome and thank you to Rob. And we're also very fortunate to have Jason Selman with us. Jason is a poet and trumpet player. He is the author of The Freedom I Stole and Africa as a Dream That Travels Through My Heart, as well as co-editor of the poetry anthology Talking Book, which chronicles the writing of Calm Unity Vibe Collective, of which he's a founding member. Jason has done extensive poetry workshops in schools and community groups, and his goal when working with youth is to show them that poetry is alive and it surrounds the world, whether through song, lyrics, or nature. So welcome and sincere thanks to Jason. So Rob, Jason, and Louise will be talking about their experience in the Culture in the Schools program and offering some tips during that panel discussion a little later. So thanks again to all three of you for taking part today. And last, but certainly not least, also joining us today is Christy Huff, who is the lead consultant for ELAN Arts and Education Initiatives. In a few moments, Christy's going to start us off by saying a few words to get us started. But we have a lot to cover today. I do just want to give you a quick outline of how we're going to proceed before I hand things over. So first, I'll quickly provide a bit of information about Quebec Relations and our services. Try to keep that fairly brief because we're short for time. Then I'll pass things over to Christy and Louise for the presentation part of today's webinar. And then we've set aside a good amount of time for our panel and what I'm sure is going to be a really interesting discussion, really helpful for everybody to hear the firsthand experience of these artists in how they've navigated culture in the schools. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll close off with a question and answer period. So if you do have any questions sort of throughout the presentation, please feel free to type them in the chat and I will keep track of them. So before we continue, a quick word about Quebec Relations. What is Quebec Relations? Well, it's a project that's been ongoing at ELAN since 2018. It's funded by the Secretariat for Relations with English-speaking Quebecers within the provincial government. And since we are short on time today, of all of the great stuff that we do, there's really two main things that I want you to know about. So first of all, we offer one-on-one consultations to help you find the funding that meets your needs as an artist and to figure out exactly what you need to do to apply to it. And second, if you do need a bit of help applying, we do offer free referrals to our experienced grant consultants who will provide hands-on assistance and feedback via Zoom to help you submit an application to a Quebec-based funder with greater confidence. So I'm not going to go into too much more detail about that right now, but what I want you to know is that we're offering these great services to artists like yourselves. And really all you need to do is send me an email to find out more. My email is up on the screen now. I'm also going to throw that up in the chat window in a second. So please do get in touch if you're interested. So now, without any further ado, I'm happy to turn things over to Christy to begin today's presentation.
Thank you, Nick. Nick is wonderful. Everyone do take him up on his offers. He does a fantastic job at supporting artists. Today, we're talking about how English teaching artists could be connecting more with schools, and specifically, congratulations to those of you who are newly accepted to the repertoire. We are delighted for you. This is the first realization of a new cohort of artists entering the repertoire since I began consulting with Elan on the question of how could more English artists be connecting and working in English schools in the province of Quebec. That was the basic issue we started what has become Art Ed with. And so there's two parts. English artists need to be eligible for funding opportunities for them to work in English schools. So there's a supply part of this problem, which background of me, my first love was economics and my first field of study. So supply and demand as terms may not be your preferred, but for me, they're a very natural part of my vocabulary. So in December, when we had the webinar to try to provide you with information about what we knew to help people succeed in their applications, you listened. Many of you got coaching from Louise, and some of you managed to do it all on your own. And bravo to you if you were able to do that also. But we're very grateful that QR enabled us the opportunity to equip some of you to apply with more confidence, as Nick says. And then the other part is the demand issue. We need English schools to value and thus seek out English artists to facilitate arts and culture experiences. And that is happening through culture in the schools more now, we think, than it was 6 years ago, although we don't have a great measurement on that yet. But we certainly know with our Artist Inspire grants that we're reaching more schools than we have in the past. And 200 out of 300 schools have connected with one of our artists since our beginning of that project 2 years ago. Our team, in collaboration with Elan's core staff, looks at how to be advocates for the role of teaching artists, increasing awareness, increasing knowledge that we are not in a position of equity and certainly not fully representative of the diversity of English-speaking artists getting work through government and other programs in the province. We promote, so that's the relationship building we do with education partners, community organizations. We network, we try to collaborate so that you become more visible and sought after. And we provide support and professional development opportunities. And that matters because the quality of the experiences you facilitate as individual artists is reflective of a general perception of what English teaching artists do. And I don't mean to put too much burden on you for that, but to be aware that, each artist's work matters to the body of work of English artists in the province. And you're not alone. We're here to support you. What we've built with Art Ed is new and I think wonderful in that we do offer support to artists. We listen to you about where you need professional development and we try to go find funding. And we try to build community. So I invite you to pay attention when we send out communications about your opportunities to connect and learn with us. And I look forward to learning from the team of artists here who are amongst the first people I met as artists from Elan, and I love them all. And so I will turn the floor to Louise for her very inspired and wise presentation.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Nick and Christy. You always have very flattering ways of describing me. Thank you very much. As both Nick and Christy alluded to, I'm a teaching artist, and I've worked extensively in schools throughout Quebec and across Canada, actually. I've been working the Cultural in Schools program for over 10 years, and I'm a big fan of the program. So congratulations for those of you who've just gotten in, and I hope that this presentation for you, whether you've been in the program for a short period of time or a long period of time, will be of help to you in navigating the program. So the Culture in Schools program is public monies funded by Quebec's Ministry of Education, and its purpose is to produce citizens who are actively involved in cultural life by increasing the number of cultural experiences offered to students. This is in the hopes of making citizens who are actively involved in arts and community throughout the duration of their lifetime. I'll be referring multiple times to the Culture in Schools website. It is excellent and fully bilingual. So there are many, many details that you can go and find that we won't necessarily have time to delve into in this presentation, but you'll be able to find yourself on the website. It is bilingual. If you'd like to see the artist profiles and your own, then you'll need to go to the Répertoire Culture Éducation. Unfortunately, this one is only in French. So that is important to know that this is also the website that teachers access in order to find artists. So it's very helpful to have a description of yourself and your workshops translated in order to hand over to teachers who may need a little bit of help in terms of the language. Can we go to the next slide, Nick? So the Culture in Schools program has 3 components to it. We'll be looking at 2 that are relevant to us. First of all, the cultural workshops at school, and then the school hosts an artist or writer. The eligibility for the entire program is very vast. It includes public and private schools, everyone in the youth sector from preschool to secondary, adult education, and vocational training. Next slide, please. The objectives of the program are to integrate arts and culture into schools in alignment with the Quebec Education Program, also known as the QEP. More specifically, it's meant to offer students cultural experiences that have a positive impact on their learning. And this is, of course, due to all of the great things that we know that the arts do, such as developing open-mindedness, curiosity, critical judgment, aesthetic appreciation, and more. Above and beyond that, it's also hope that it will promote collaborations between schools and cultural organizations. From what I see of the attendees here, you're mostly artists. So from here on in, I'm going to refer to artists rather than cultural organizations, but just know that all of the same criteria applies for the cultural organizations. I will be referring to the QEP many times in this workshop. So if you're familiar with it, that's great. If you're not, now's the time to do so. It's available online, and there's excellent literature around that. There's also a really excellent training session that was hosted by Elan ArtEd a few years ago with Learn's pedagogical arts consultant. And I personally learned a lot from this presentation, even though I've been working in the school system for many, many years before that. So I encourage you to go and have a listen. Next slide, please. So we'll look at the first section of the Culture in Schools, which is the cultural workshops at school. These are short-term workshops. In this case, the role of the artist is to lead students in active, participatory, creative workshops. And we're looking at, in these workshops, at the art form as a means of expression and various aspects of the craft. The artist is expected to share their creativity with students and introduce students to arts occupations. So for example, if you're doing a theater workshop, it's not necessarily just about the acting. It could be, but it could also be about everything that goes into putting a play on. From sound design to lighting to costuming, it can really be very comprehensive. If you were accepted into the workshop, then you were accepted based on your description that you sent in. So you'll be very familiar with the workshops that are possible within the school. The role of the teacher is to apply for the funding and make connections with the famous QEP. So it's really very much in your best interest to understand the QEP and to know the language that teachers speak so that you're making the teacher's job easier. Next slide, please. For financial assistance, cultural workshops covers differently for public and private schools. For public schools, they cover 75 to 100% of the total budget, and this is determined by individual school boards. So not by you or me or the teacher. The teacher needs to go to the school board to find out what percentage is being covered this year. In the case of private schools, it's always 75% of the total budget. The remainder of the budget is covered by the school, and so this is why the principal needs to sign off on the application forms to ensure that they have the budget to cover it. Next slide, please. For eligible expenses, I encourage you to have a look at the website for complete details because there are formula that help you write out the budget. There's no negotiation with Culture in Schools. It's all established by the ministry. So always interesting to know what we're paid as artists. The fees are $325 per day, per in-class day. This includes your preparation. And if you charge taxes, then that goes on top of the $325. For this fee, you can give a maximum of 3 workshops per day and 3 days at the same school. Sometimes they will fund 5 days, but this is really exceptional and for very special projects. There are many other expenses that can be covered, including transportation, meals, accommodation, materials, and school prep. And an interesting thing to note for those of you who have already been part of Culture in Schools, they are now including tech support for video conferencing, which I think will be a relief for many of us who've been working online a lot in the last year. Next slide, please. Ineligible expenses. This is important to know, and it all falls out around the mandate of the program to have students have hands-on active participation in arts making experiences. So it's not eligible to apply for fees for the presentation of a show, purchase of permanent equipment, or training for teachers and partners. Next slide, please. The program administration for this section is by the individual school boards. So it's important to know that because every school board that you'll work with may be slightly different. The deadlines are set by the school board, and these deadlines can vary from year to year. I usually just speak with the teacher and prepare my projects to be applied for in the first week of October, and then I generally know that I'm not missing a deadline. The assessment of the applications is done by the school board arts consultant, and they're looking for effective collaboration between the teacher and the artist with a plan for preparation and transfer of learning activities by the teacher outside of the workshops. The number of the students is a maximum of 35, although this can be lower when it's called for. And it's being assessed also according to active participation of students and the connections with the QEP. And we put in the link there to the QEP training session for you once more. Next slide, please. The notification of results also depends on the school board. It generally happens at the end of November. And when you're planning your project, this means that you'll want to receive those results before the start date of the project. Very few schools that I know of want to have projects in December, so this generally means that your start date is going to be January, and the projects usually run from January to early June. For payment, the artist submits an invoice to the school, and the school is obliged to make that payment within 30 days of the workshop. Next slide. Moving on to the other part of Culture in Schools, schools host an artist or writer. In some ways, this is similar to the workshops. In some ways, it's very different. This is a large-scale project in which you're in residency at the school for 4 to 12 weeks. The biggest difference with this part is that there's a student project and then there's an artist project. For the workshops, it's only a student project. But in this case, the student project and the artist project are equally important and need to be equally well articulated in your application form. The artist project is meant to be inspired by the school environment and the student project, and it's meant to allow students to observe you at work, a professional artist. For each week that you spend at the school, you are expected to spend a maximum of 20 hours per week there. 5 to 10 hours of this week is in class with the students, and the remaining number of hours is devoted to the artist's work. The hours and weeks don't have to be consecutive. Next slide. The roles of the artist and teacher are very similar to the cultural workshops in schools, but there's much more extensive collaboration between the two, right from the planning stages. The application is really quite hefty, it's very large, and it needs to be equally well thought out, equally well written, equally well supported by the artist and the teacher. There's one point that I'd really like to highlight here, and it's important enough that I'm going to read a quote from the website. So, quote, "The teacher must be an active participant in the project and provide pedagogical expertise. The cultural partner in no way serves as a substitute for the teacher during the project." So you are not a sub. You're there as a guest artist, and you're bringing something different than the teacher. There have been issues with this in the past in the program, But I found when I have really good discussions with the teacher before I arrive, and they're really excited and implicated in the project, then I really haven't had a problem with this. That's just something to know in advance. If you're interested by this program, there's one more information session that is being held by the ministry on September 28th. This will be in French, and there's documents available in English. I attended yesterday and it was excellent, and we'll be forwarding the documents in English to you in the follow-up email to this webinar. Next slide, please. So Schools Host an Artist is managed differently than the workshops. In this case, the Ministry of Education manages everything. So the deadline is set every year on October 15th, and the assessment of the applications is by a jury rather than by one arts consultant. This jury is made up of teachers, artists, and representatives from the ministry. You usually get the results in early December, so that's again important to take into account when you're setting the start date. Generally, again, January to June. When you do receive an acceptance, please make sure that you sign a contract with the school before the project starts. The application to the program is not a contract. You'll need to draw this up yourself with the school. Next slide, please. The eligibility criteria is actually kind of more important for the artists to know than the teachers. We are allowed to submit 2 applications per year with a maximum of 18 weeks total. Sorry, I will clarify what I said. I'm not sure if we're required to submit only 2, but you will only receive 2 for the year, to a maximum of 18 weeks total. Artists are expected to live in the same or neighboring region as the school, although there are exceptions made for remote areas where it might be more difficult to get a variety of artists in different disciplines. The project needs to start and finish during the same school year and take place in regular school hours. That includes your your creative work. That makes sense because the students are intended to see you work and see your work as it progresses. Next slide, please. Ineligible projects are very similar to cultural workshops. The ones that are not eligible are those focused solely on theoretical knowledge, one-off workshops, projects focused exclusively on cultural outreach or fundraising activities. So the point of this program is really to make sure that the students experience a full creative project themselves, hands-on. Next slide, please. The financial assistance for this program is very interesting for schools, as well as artists, I think. Culture in Schools covers 100% of the artist fees, including taxes, and up to 75% of the other fees. The school then covers the remainder of that 75%. In terms of what we're paid, the artist fees are $1,000 per week. Eligible expenses also include accommodation, materials, and administrative costs incurred by the school. I would encourage you to make sure that the school does apply for administrative costs, because it will make somebody at the school responsible for helping you get your project underway. And having a bit of money there certainly helps somebody free up their time in order to do so. So do have a look at the Culture in Schools website for this. There are a lot of details on there that we just don't really have the time to go into today, but it's very clearly written. Next slide, please. Ineligible expenses are the same as Culture in Schools and a little bit more in depth. So similarly to the workshops, there are no entrance fees to shows, either professional or amateur, whether at the school or at a venue, no purchase of permanent equipment, no professional development for teachers and artists. How this is different than the workshops is that there are no extra costs related to you producing your work. So you're being funded to do the creative work. You're not funded for publishing or reproducing your final work, and there's no fees that are eligible for professionals who are not directly involved in the project or for a cultural mediator. In this case, the cultural mediator is you. Next slide, please. As I've mentioned before, the collaboration between the artist and teacher is really key for this program, and the application process is significant. So do start early if you're interested in having a residency, and talk frequently with the teacher. Again, there's a really excellent page on the website, Schools Host an Artist, and it will show you exactly what you need. Next slide. From here on in, none of the information will actually be found on the website, but it's information that I think is important for you to think about as you're moving forward. So if you have a project that is larger or doesn't quite fit into culture in schools, there may be ways to make it happen through combining funds with other organizations. There are many organizations across Quebec that support artists going into schools, and you see just a few of them there, from Artist Inspires to Quebec Writers Federation to Mask and more. Personally, I've had a lot of success combining funds with Culture in Schools and Artist Inspire, as well as arts organizations with dedicated cultural mediation funding and in-school funding. But that's just me. I'm sure that other people have had great success combining the sources of funding with other organizations as well too. If you choose to go this route, it's really important to respect the mandate of each organization so that then they can then respect the mandate of their funders. So you need to be clear and transparent with the organizations, the schools, and the teachers so they understand what you're doing and how you're doing it, and they know that there's no double dipping going on. Next slide, please. To show you how this might be possible, I'm going to do a case study of combining funds from the cultural workshops, so the short-term one, and Artists Inspire. So the first thing that I generally do when I know that I have a project that is interesting and larger than some of the single funding sources I have is I'll look at the funding source and their mandate and look at where there are points of intersection and where there are points of divergence. So in the case of cultural workshops in school, it's funded by the province, the Ministry of Education, and their mandate makes sense when it is coming out of that. It's to provide arts experiences to students across Quebec. Artists Inspire is somewhat different because it's more targeted. It comes from the Government of Canada and it's for minority languages. So the mandate there is to provide arts and cultural experiences in English public school boards across Quebec. So even just knowing that starts to give me a good idea of where and how I could combine funds from these two sources. Next slide, please. If we dig into the nitty-gritty of each organization, then we start to get a little bit more focused. So the cultural workshops can occur basically anywhere in the educational system, as you see in the middle column. And Artists in Schools is more targeted. It needs to happen in the English public elementary and secondary schools. The language of instruction in cultural workshops is in English or French, and Artists Inspire is meant to be in English. The technicalities of how we determine duration, timeline, and fees is different for both organizations. If you look at the cultural workshops in school, they tend to fund 3 days of 3 workshops per day, and they occur from January to June. The fee is pre-established for us at $325 a day in project costs. Artists Inspire works a bit differently, so it's more negotiable. So you do have a little bit of flex in that area in terms of how much time you spend with specific groups of students, as well as how those fees are allocated. In terms of billing, this is a technicality that is important for you to know as an artist, and I can guarantee you the teacher will forget. So just make sure that you are really clear about this. For cultural workshops, you as the artist bill the school. In terms of Artists Inspire, you actually bill Learn, and the school is not part of it at all. Next slide, please. So if we look at the points of intersection between the programs, the most obvious place that I can see this would happen is in a Quebec English public elementary or secondary school in English for a duration of, say, 6 days of 3 workshops per day. Now, I get those 6 days of 3 workshops per day because in order to reduce the confusion with the teacher, I generally quote the rate that Culture in School offers as my Artists Inspire rate, just to make sure that it's equal across. There's, of course, various different ways that you can do that, but that does end up being a rough guideline of 6 days of 3 workshops per day, which is quite substantial. If we look at the timeline based on the deadline of cultural workshops, then it's likely to occur from January to June. Next slide. So the interesting part, I think, is where the programs diverge and how we can start to use these differences in a really interesting way. So for example, given the mandate and the eligibility criteria of these 2 programs, it'd be possible to do an intergenerational project in which the adult education part is funded by Cultural in Schools and paired with an elementary or secondary school funded by Artists Inspire. This project could be bilingual, since the Culture in Schools part could be in French and the Artists Inspire in English. You also have a little bit of flex around the Artists Inspire negotiable duration and fees, which is interesting to note. because you might be able to take this part of your funding in order to allocate more time to really enthusiastic teachers and students. The timeline is a little different because you're eligible to apply for Artists Inspire all the time. So you could have a start date in the fall instead of in January. This might be a little tricky because you would only have confirmation of the Culture in Schools funding after you'd already started the Artists Inspire, but it's still a possibility. The thing I find particularly interesting with Artists Inspire's negotiable fees is that you can account for your prep time and production time. So I've certainly used this when I've had a project that has had a lot of audio and video editing, so that I make sure that I'm compensated fairly for the work that I do outside of class time. So I'm sure that many of you will look at these two programs and have more ideas of how these programs intersect and how they diverge. And that's the interesting thing. That's where the creativity really starts to happen. Next slide. So I often have discussions with people about how to contact schools. And this will be much of the topic of conversation for the panel discussion. So just to give you a bit of an overview, there are many different ways. In my experience, and a lot of the artists that I know, we often get invited into schools by people that we know. So it might be schools in your neighborhood, schools that your children or your friends' children attend, or say places where your friends who are teachers teach. There's also a lot of teachers associations that you can get involved with. PD days, conferences, many of those are happening online, but they are really a great way to actually get to know people. Next slide, please. There are also many organizations that help to support schools, and many of them will have already developed relationships with the schools. So you can think of contacting cultural committees, Maison de la Culture, and other community centers. So obviously this is not an exhaustive list. It's just a way to get you started in thinking about what kinds of places you could contact and start to develop relationships with them. Next slide, please. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Nick as the moderator of the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Louise. That was a really great and clear and concise presentation. And I know it was a heroic task to get all that information down into a manageable amount of time, but thank you for doing so. Christy, yeah, was there something you wanted to add?
Just the one thing, which is that in pulling together this presentation and in the 5 years we've been working with Elan, there is a woman who works for the Ministry of Culture named Magali Cardin, who has been extraordinarily helpful to us. And I want to let you, those of you who are in Montreal, she coordinates for Montreal. She has no obligation for us as a provincial organization to invest so much time in helping us to understand how the program works, and she does. She makes herself available. So thank you to Magali, even though she's not here to hear it. I think it's important to acknowledge that she's been extraordinarily helpful to us.
Absolutely. And actually that list of strategies, much of that came from Magali. She's very approachable, really, really, really easy to talk to, and passionate about getting artists to pair and work with schools.
So, and thank you, Louise, for that wonderful, wonderful presentation.
My pleasure.
Indeed. So I guess at this point, I'll invite Jason and Rob to unmute and virtually step forward to join us for the panel discussion. Thank you again for being here today.
Welcome. Pleasure.
So I've got just a couple of questions, I suppose, to get us started and get everybody talking here. So we'll start sort of from the beginning. What strategies did you use to contact schools and book your work when you were really first starting out with the Culture in Schools program?
I'll say from my side, I didn't really use a strategy per se. When I got accepted into the repertoire, it was kind of through touring around, working around the province, and it just gave me a way to contact schools in areas where I was touring to say that this was something available. It didn't always work because there's a hard deadline but if I knew a long enough ahead of time, then I could use it as a potential other prong in my touring, that I could do some work in schools. And I think, your point about local schools, that was also something that teachers that knew that I was doing workshops for many, many years before I was ever part of the repertoire through folk festivals and blues festivals and such. And people knew that I was doing that. And some teachers that I knew would say, "Are you part of the repertoire? Are you part of the, are you part of the repertoire?" I kept hearing that, you know, so I thought, okay, I better apply. And then when I applied, you know, I've worked with them through that. And now with Artists Inspire, that gives you another opportunity to get funding. But that was part of it. It was really driven by teachers knowing that I did workshops and wondering if they could hire me. But I had to join the repertoire for that to happen for them. So that was really how I got started.
For me, I emailed schools. I emailed a lot of schools. I would just go through and look at the list of all the schools in you know, the EMSB or SB Pearson School, but I just emailed all the schools, and that was not the best strategy. But I really wanted to get the work, and it wasn't the best strategy because there wasn't a high level of response, and I was, you know, sending stuff more to, you know, the secretary. But what I learned is that even though it's difficult, what Rob is saying, what Louise is saying is true. It's about your connections. And once I did get schools little by little, it's really about your connection with the teachers. And that's hard to have a connection when you haven't been in any schools. But once it starts to happen, I think that's where the work comes, because once someone sees you can do the work well, and they appreciate the way you do the work, then you get more and more work, because other teachers will want to work with you, and people in the schools, you know, arts coordinators, all these people who are part of the infrastructure of the school will begin to contact you more and more and more, and then it over the course of many years, it snowballed. The ball was very, very small in the beginning, but now it's pretty big, and it took a lot of time of kind of like, how do I do this? But, you know, before I knew it, the work was just coming relatively easily.
I think for me, a lot of it was that I've always had kind of like a two-pronged career that is artist and educator. And so I've known a lot of teachers, and I've also known over the course of my career a lot of artists who have gone into education or come back out of education. And so I know quite a few people within the system, and we just, you know, get excited and brainstorm ideas and yeah, just figure things out that way. Once I mean, that was more when I was closer to grad school, but once I've gotten further away from grad school, I started to realize that I needed to foster those connections and those relationships. And I started giving a lot of PD workshops. And PD workshops are awesome because, you know, somebody who shows up at my workshop is enthusiastic about music and sound somehow. And then I actually teach them through doing. And oftentimes, like, I'll get queries from that. Are you in culture in schools? And the answer will be like, yes. Do you want to bring me in? So that has been really crucial for me in developing an ongoing network of people. But I would totally second Jason's point of this being a long game about developing relationships over time. So one of the people that I had a fantastic project with in 2020 was somebody who I'd met and started talking with 5 years before. It rarely ever happens 5 days before, like it's 5 years. So I think similarly to both Jason and Rob, like it starts little by little, and then it kind of takes on somewhat of a life of its own, although it constantly takes cultivating those relationships.
Yeah, I would say also arts consultants have been really helpful in different boards. It's about the connections that you make, and you make them little by little, but they pay off in the long run.
So I think my next question for everyone is maybe jumping off some of the things I'm hearing just now, and sort of maybe on the subject of managing expectations, particularly at the beginning of this process. Maybe you could talk about what role schoolwork and culture in the schools plays in your career, and sort of approximately what percentage of your income is actually earned through culture in the schools at this point.
For me, it's not much, you know, through culture in the schools. I mean, it's, you know, I might do 2 or 3 projects through that organization or through that repertoire per year, but I'm content with that, because I think managing expectations is really important because I think, when you first join, I've only been on maybe 5 or 6 years. I don't remember exactly what you think. 2016 is when I joined. And I think it's important not to expect too much from it. It's really should be, I think, as a sort of a part of what you do. I mean, it depends on who you are. And I do a lot of work in schools, but I'm talking repertoire particularly. $300 a day is decent pay. I don't think it's extraordinarily good pay, frankly. It's a lot of work. And so, I do it because I like doing it and it's rewarding in other ways, but I wouldn't expect it to be a massive part of my income. That's my experience. Other workshops, Artists Inspire and then schools funding you can sometimes, when they're all put together, it becomes maybe for me, maybe 25 or 30% of my income, or 20, maybe 20%. I'd have to look at it, but the actual repertoire itself, not a huge amount. And I think managing expectations is really important because, when I started, you get projects and you kind of, learn how to work with the repertoire and how the applications work and working with schools through this program. It's a little different. It's a little more bureaucratic than say Artists Inspire is. It's not brutal, but it's not as easy per se. And I think it's good to start slowly because you bite off a little bit and you do one and you kind of learn. And this is more about doing workshops too. And then, as you go further, you develop your skills and you can take on more. And anyway, I'm kind of rambling now, but for me, I don't look at it like a massive percentage of my income. That's all I'd say.
I agree. For me, it's not a gigantic part of it, but it's for me, it's significant and important because I really, really enjoy the work. And when I include Artists Inspire, QWF, all the other funding bodies, that will become the majority of my income. And then the rest is work that I'm doing as an artist, but it's little by little by little. And I think, once Artists Inspire came along, it really helped a lot because, as Louise was saying, combining the funding and letting the projects become bigger and bigger and bigger, or, being asked to be a part of Schools Host an Artist helped a lot. But it really was, building something little by little by little. And I think in the beginning, I had very high expectations. And I think in the first 2-3 years, I did the ATEC conference, and I think I also did the QPAC conference. And I figured, what, through that conference, I'd make a lot of connections with teachers, and I'd be set. And that didn't happen. I made certain contacts that were really, really important, but there was still a lot of work to do, and there's still a lot of work to do. So I think it's the most important thing is to not put all your eggs in one basket, because it's not going to work, but eventually the eggs will add up. And it's about saying, okay, I'm going to do, hopefully aim for this much work here, but also do this and do this, and really make all of it come together to get a life for yourself. In terms of QWF, it's Quebec Writers Federation. ATEC is, sorry, one second. It's a teachers conference. I'm not sure what it stands for, but it's ATEQ, and it's a teachers association, and they have a conference every year.
So I agree with everything Jason just said. The percentage varies greatly from year to year of how much I actually draw from culture in schools. Some years it's been 10%. Other years, pre-Artists Inspire time, it was up to 80% some years, And that actually suits me because I surf between projects, and sometimes I'll have a big arts project that takes an enormous amount of time, and I don't necessarily want to be in a school 5 days a week or 3, and sometimes I need to take a break from the big artistic production, and I need to go and feed myself by interacting with other people. I know that's kind of particular to me because I do participatory arts. So I need that back and forth with people. And I really love that. I'm very passionate about that. And I love to see how excited people get when they're able to be creative. So yeah, I think managing the expectations is really important. Also to know that over the period of time that I've worked in culture in schools, I think maybe a maximum of 5 schools have contacted me through the Repertoire Culture Éducation. I have contacted and brokered the vast majority of my relations myself. So getting into the culture in schools is very important because it gives you access to funding. But you're not going to have people beating down your door saying, I want you to come into my school. It takes a lot of cultivation of a variety of contacts and also a variety of income sources, as I think both Jason and Rob were saying, in order to make a life as an artist.
So maybe on a similar wavelength, what do you know now that you maybe wish you knew when you were first accepted in culture in the schools? Or what do you think the most important thing for an artist is to know when working in schools?
I've got a good one for that. I think the most important thing is to go into a school knowing and acknowledging that you're a guest. And if you're a guest, then you need to behave accordingly. So you need to take the time to get to know people and to understand how that school and the school system works. Because, just the same way as I wouldn't come over to your house and start criticizing the decoration in your living room or the food that you serve me. I'm going to be a good guest and know that this is not my place to criticize how things are happening. I can help. But I am an outsider in this system and a welcome outsider, but it's not my place to be really changing everything. So that comes, that sort of falls out to things like respecting school schedule. It's a big deal if you go 5 minutes over. If you go 5 minutes over class time, it might mean that an entire class might miss a school bus, or some student might not actually get their meds on time. And that's a big deal for a school. So there's some basic things of just really understanding and respecting school schedule and respecting the role and responsibilities and demands that are placed on teachers that I think we as artists can be better guests if we understand that. When I was first starting to work in culture in schools, the biggest thing that I heard from people was, wow, you're such a good teacher. Then that was always followed up with, I had this artist in my schools a few years ago, and I swore I would never have another one in because they just didn't get it. That's happened less in recent years, and I think that's because there's more training available and there's more support coming from various different organizations. But it's, in my mind, too frequently the comment that I hear from teachers. So I think really approaching the education system with a lot of respect and knowing that if a teacher makes a last minute change, it's probably for a very good reason, that they might not have time to explain to you what it is, but they're still asking for you to change something. And so you just need to roll with it and go with it. So it's also a wonderful thing. I love being a guest in the education system. I am so inspired by the wonderful teachers and the amazing students that I've worked with. So that was a long way to say of what I think is important to know when you're working in the school system for the first time.
I would say 3 things. One, to go with what Louise is saying, your workshop is your first, calling card. How well you do your work is going to determine how much work you get. If you do a really good job, teachers are going to remember because they also remember when the work is not done well. So be prepared for anything, especially in this Zoom age. So many things can happen. Connections can fall apart, or you can lose audio. So just be really, really ready. And I think, this last year and a half of COVID has forced me to be even more ready than I was before and just plan everything out as much as possible. But do the best job you can because they're going to remember, and you need those teachers to have your back to get more work, but also just to build relationships that are going to help you become a better teaching artist and a better artist in general, just a better ally to the school and the students. Also, there are no guarantees in terms of how much work you're going to get, in terms of being contacted by various schools, and then for whatever reason, the contract kind of falls apart. I mean, once you get to a certain point where the contracts have been signed, those things are pretty solid. But in the midst of the negotiation, sometimes things don't work out, and you can't do the workshop, or they don't get back to you, or you might forget to get back to them. Things happen. So there's not a guarantee that you're going to get the same amount of work. Like Lutz was saying as well, how much work you get from cultural schools one year does not determine how much you get the next year. You can always hope and you do the best you can, but you never know what's going to happen. And I would say the other thing is, sorry, 1 second. Sorry. Teachers are busy. They have a lot to do. So, be able to get back at them without, nagging. But it's really important to kind of have a sense of, okay, I have to correspond with them on a regular basis, to follow up on things and reassure them. I think things like sending them, the outline of the workshop beforehand, so they're reassured. I think there's a lot of not always having complete trust, because as Louise said, you're a guest. They don't know what you're going to do or how you're going to do it, how well you're going to perform in terms of being in their class, what your approach is. It's a leap of faith for them. And once they've seen you do the work and they have trust in you, they will open up a lot. But initially, because they're giving up their classroom and their time and their space, you have to reassure them as much as possible going in, so they're not worried, because they don't know what to expect. Once they see you and you do the job well, you can get to work with them again. But you have to be able to reassure them as much as possible that you know what you're doing.
I agree with basically everything that was said. I mean, being a guest, clearly you need to respect everybody. And so I'm not going to repeat, those points. But I think the one I would harp on is preparation, like being ready is really important. If you've done a workshop before, you might think, oh, I've done this, I always spend way more time preparing, because I just feel like it makes me ultimately ready. And as Jason just said, things change, things go differently than you expect all the time. So you need to, that preparation allows you to adjust as you need to. Make it easy on the teacher. I think that's really important. I also think managing expectations is important. Like, if you promise the moon to a teacher, then your stress level is going to be very high. And I think a lot of artists think, okay, I got to get this gig. So I got to really promise, that I'm going to change lives and reinvent the wheel, et cetera. And I think that just it's not realistic. I think, you're bringing something special, your uniqueness to a class. And if you've done the work for a while, you're going to, kids are going to take what you have, from you. They're going to see what it is and they're going to understand it. But I feel like that just sets the bar at a really uncomfortable place for everybody. And I feel like it's good to just be realistic about what you're going to bring to the class. And the last thing I would say is, doing when I started, you said what I wish I knew when I started. I was nervous when I started, nervous to be in a classroom, be in front of kids. And I've been doing it a long time, and I'm not nervous really now, but I still get a little nerves, but nerves are good. Nerves translate into good energy, but I would say the one thing that really I find is I go in and I really try to have fun, and I like engage with the kids and see what they're doing and like listen to them, and they say funny things and they have really cool ideas. It's like if I'm lost in my own fear and nerves, I miss all that. And if I'm just there and I'm just who I am, just delivering something that I'm hoping to share and hopefully is helpful to them, I can really be with them and get to know these kind of really quirky, interesting kids. And that's something that I've learned. I did not do that well at first. I was sort of had a wall up. My nerves, I'm going to deliver my program. It's all going to go well. And now it's more the fences are down, just kind of in the class and doing what I do as well as I can. So that's what I would say.
I'd like to add one thing to that. because I'm absolutely a fan of preparation. And it totally reassures the teacher because they know that you're going to come in and do a good job, and they're going to understand how they can make links with the QEP, that they're not wasting class time. But when I prepare a project, I make sure that I'm preparing a project that has a lot of room to move. So I'm building in flexibility within that, because there might be a fire alarm that happens in one of your 3 classes that you have with one group. You know, there might be half of the students there because for whatever reason, you know, they had a field trip with another class. You know, so it's important to make sure that you're building that flexibility into your program and that you're communicating that with your teacher. I have to say that the managing expectations is a big one because I do a lot of music production. And I think oftentimes teachers don't really understand what's involved in actually putting out a product. Everybody, like high schools, always want a video that they can use to promote their school with. And I'm careful about those things because I want to make sure that my $325 a day is going towards the students being creative and making sure that I'm not, you know, at the wee hours of the morning, doing all kinds of production in order to deliver something that I promised to the teacher. So I'm very, very careful about the discussions leading up to a project to make sure that me and the teacher are on the same page and that we have similar expectations. When there's those discussions, then I get excited about the project, they get excited about the project, and then of course the students are going to jump on board that excitement. It means that everybody's going to have a good time.
Christy, did you want to add something?
Just when I started giving the orientations for Artists Inspire and spoke about schools, my dad had been an elementary school principal, and I did always say to the artists, janitors and secretaries are really, really important people in schools. Have a lot of respect for them and what they have to do in the course of a day. And so in terms of the janitor, that means you arrive in time to set your own stuff up. Like if you're going to end up calling them for something, you know, they try to know where you're going to be in space and have time for the setup, that they don't have to help you in some way if you've got to move furniture or I don't know what it is. It's not so much for them as the setup, it's the cleanup. Be responsible for the mess you make. And the other part, the secretary, culture in the schools is paid through the school. There's a reason schools asked us not to have that be the case for Artists Inspire, and that's why Learn does it. And it's, you know, the secretaries are such busy people. Frankly, teachers aren't often strong on the admin part. So you getting paid depends on a teacher taking the correct action with your paperwork and the secretary understanding it and how she files it and gets it reimbursed. And so just try to be really patient, because if those people haven't done this before, they can just seem prickly and defensive or overwhelmed because they're doing a task that is extra and they don't know how to do it yet. So be aware that being gracious with these people, and it gets hard because I know there's someone in this audience who took like 6 months to have a school pay them one time, or maybe more than one time. And I'm sure that can get really frustrating, but the last thing you want is the impression the school has of you to be dominated by your getting aggressive about being paid. So if you're ever really stuck with a school not paying you, we also are willing to help you and figure out how to intervene in that without it escalating into something really uncomfortable.
Yeah, just following up on that, the way that I avoid those situations, which has happened very rarely for me, you know, knock on wood, is that I bill, like I send the invoice while I'm at the school with enough time to follow up. So if it's only a 3-day workshop, I would probably bill the first day, because then I've got 2 more days when I can be physically there in order to make sure that my paperwork gets to the right office and the right desk. When it comes to schools hosted workshop, I've generally billed halfway through so that, again, there's time for people to understand the paperwork. So I never ever wait until it's done, which is somewhat unusual, but I'm a guest there. I'm not going to be there again. So if there's anything to be figured out, then I want to not have to make an extra trip to that school or be on phone a million times in order to make sure that my payment is coming through.
Picking up on a point from just now in terms of sort of you know, the importance of sort of reassuring teachers. I know in our previous conversation, I heard it talked about the importance of making teachers feel sort of really involved and implicated in the process, both for themselves and sort of for the students as well, to see them as kind of a key part of the process. Could you maybe talk about some ways of doing that, or strategies for making sure that, you know, the students really recognize the role of their own teacher in the process as having, you know, facilitated your work in the classroom?
Well, for me as a writer, I try to encourage the teachers to write the assignments that I'm doing and to share and participate as much as possible, because what I'm doing in terms of poetry is asking the students to be vulnerable. And for me to model that is one thing, but for the teachers to model that is priceless. And they will then reciprocate that vulnerability and that openness to write what they're being asked to write, and to share. And that's to me the most valuable thing. That's kind of like the cherry on top that will make the workshop be the best that it can be, when the teachers are open enough to be vulnerable with their own emotions in front of their teachers, and give the students a different side of who they are, because they're opening up their classroom to me, and to say that I trust this person enough to be vulnerable in front of these students who I'm going to have to manage that vulnerability with once me as an artist have left.
I've had that experience. I do songwriting, and I've had teachers jump on board. I don't push them one way or the other. I always do the exercise, but some teachers have just done it, and I've sort of left it to them. But yeah, I agree. It does show vulnerability. I would say that in this case, with my experience, and everyone's done different things, but with my experience, there are two types of workshops. There's one where teachers want to be involved, so they want to collaborate and they want to take it to a next level. For example, I was at Royal West last year, and I did all of the Sec 5 recording students. There's a music recording program there, and there they wanted to do some songwriting, and then what they started with me, they had to take into a finished song. So I collaborated with the teachers to do that, and then that became an assignment for them to write this tune based on a certain chord structure and a certain, limits. But then I was at St. Thomas, and the teacher there really was, looking for someone to come in and bring something different. She didn't really want to be involved. She wanted me to take over and run the class and give the students something completely outside what they were getting in the music program there. And so that was clear, and I did that. And so both of them can work. Sometimes they want you to link it, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they want to just have something different, a break for the kids, and then they'll get back to their regular things. They might riff off what you've given, but so I think it's important to communicate with the teacher and see what they want. Do you want me to link this? Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. Sometimes it's a unique thing, discrete to what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. For sure, it's really different from teacher to teacher. I think oftentimes that the responsibility for that, I've found that teachers have actually taken it on themselves. So I am hardly ever in a room without the teacher. And the kids know their teacher well, so like the teacher's going to be there, they're going to be welcoming their students, they're going to be welcoming me. And then there's some form of introduction that then gets kind of passed over to me. And I take a certain amount of time at the beginning of every project to, acknowledge that I'm new. And I'll find something about the school or the classroom or anything about the environment that I'm like, wow, I see so much artwork on the walls. It's really wonderful to see all of the colors. And it looks to me like you've got a theme around fall. Is that right? So it's showing that I'm interested and engaged. And the teacher, usually there's a lot of back and forth there. I've had the luck, I guess, of working with a lot of teachers who are very engaged. So it's not difficult, I find, oftentimes to have teachers be involved because they want it to go well. If they've gone to the trouble of bringing me in, then they're invested in making sure that it goes well. There are other workshops that I've done that have been more cookie cutter workshops funded by other organizations in which, the teacher sits at the back and surfs on their phone. But there's still always that introduction at the beginning where the teacher is kind of handing over the trust from them to me as a guest. And when that's done, the students follow, they understand. But in general, with culture in schools and Artists Inspire, like the teachers are usually in there like a dirty sock. And if they're not, then I find ways to invite them in that is hopefully appropriate for them. Oftentimes, I get teachers who don't have a lot of time to get their hands on their instruments, so they're going to want to play. So similarly to Jason, like they get actually to have the fun of playing and show their chops a bit rather than always being in front of.
It's a great point. So this is sort of a big question, and maybe no clear answers here because we're all still obviously working through this. But how has COVID sort of changed the way you go about proposing your services in the classroom these days?
With care. I would say, at least for me, there's a lot more discussion in advance, and I'm really careful not to be pushy, because I think that teachers have a huge job right now, and it's been very stressful for a year and a half. So the last thing I want to do is overwhelm a teacher with 5 unanswered emails, asking them to contact me about something that they may not want. So I found that my projects during this time have been largely with people that I've known for a very long time, that we already have a lot of trust built up in each other, and ones where we've often already done projects. So we know we can work well together. We know we can be flexible as we need to be, and we know that we're going to give a great experience to the artists. Sorry, to the students. Who are the artists?
I think it's about being prepared, as we've said, several times, and being even more prepared, and also as a writer, opening the door for them to send the work back to me if they want to, and I can give them feedback afterwards to reinforce that connection between myself and the school. Because normally when I'm in the classroom, I can go through and work the room and see what they're doing, but I think in COVID, there's so much more trust that has to be bestowed on the teacher and then buying in, because I can't see how much they're writing when I'm on Zoom. So I have to trust that the work is getting done. And sometimes students will come up to the front of the class, to the computer, and show me on camera what they've done, and that's great. But also to get the work afterwards and give them the feedback, I think it's required a lot of focus, a lot of care, and a lot of patience. But I think all of those things, when I step back into the classroom, will make what I do a better experience, because they will appreciate even more, and so will I, just being there. Where I think there's work to make that connection with the students when you're not there. I think when you're there, the things that are natural, like your banter and your demeanor, are really important, and you have to push a little bit harder to make that connection with the students when you're not physically present, so that they can have a sense of who you are and what your personality is, where things are not as obvious or three-dimensional.
Yeah, I would agree with both of those things, with what Jason just said and what Louise said, and I would also say getting a decent sound setup, doing a sound check. If you're doing Zoom, like I do virtual, and I'm playing music, and so I need to make sure I sound decent. So I invested in some equipment, and I do a sound check before I do any workshop, not with the teacher. I do it with a friend of mine to make sure my levels are good. You can hear the guitar, you can hear the voice. It's not too much on either side, because that's a sure sign. You can destroy your workshop if your sound is brutal. And then I also think, like Jason said, like I set up shared drives because they're writing lyrics and they're going to send them to me. So I always set up, with the teacher, either she does or he does, or I do. I offer. It depends on how they want to follow through with it. But sometimes they'll set up a shared drive where all the lyrics will go, and so we know where it is. There's an address for that, and so just these little infrastructural things before need to be done if you're going to be doing it virtually. And then the other thing I would say is, I've noticed that some kids actually do better in virtual, where they don't have to be in person sharing out loud with a group of kids. Like sometimes it's easier to send lyrics, anonymously or with a name, but not visible to anyone. That's something I've noticed as well. And so that's kind of just a nice thing to be aware of, that there are kids that actually maybe prefer virtual. Anyway.
Yeah. Virtual learning is such a different thing. As far as like the artist-teacher relationship, like the teachers have to be so much more involved than if I'm there alone. Like there's just no option for the teacher to just drink their coffee. you know, and just thinking of one of my workshops last year, I was working with a special needs classroom of just like these awesome, enthusiastic, adorable little kids. And, you know, we were doing our thing and then like, boom, they all disappeared. I couldn't see a single person on my Zoom screen. Like nothing, nothing at all. And like, we'd been doing something that they were really enthusiastic about. And I was like trying to like look around my computer so I could see around the corner of the Zoom screen. Like I had no idea what was going on. You know, so in that case, you kind of go, okay, I just hope nobody's hurting themselves. And you rely on the teacher being able to gauge the vibe in the room and being equally engaged. And generally, I would say that most of the teachers I've worked with, especially virtually, have been so grateful to have the support and the ideas, because they're just maxed out, you know. So to have more creativity coming from somebody who isn't tapped out to that same degree, because we don't interact with that system all the time. Like they're just so glad to have somebody come and help out and give them new ideas of how they could be doing things.
We can tell you about the wonderful coaching sessions that we're very happy to offer with Louise for anybody who's interested. Louise, do you want to say a few words about this?
Sure. Yep. So I'll be available for 1 to 1.5 hour coaching sessions for everybody who's on this call. Just know as a caveat, I am not an agent of the program. I'm someone who's accessed the program a lot. So I can do my best to help you, but I may also be saying, okay, here's my best idea, and you need to call your representative. So I'm more than happy to sit down and chat with you and address whatever it is, whether it's brainstorming what is possible or giving you directions to contacting certain associations or schools. I'm happy to do that. The process to do that will be to email Nick and indicate your interest, as well as list 2 or 3 questions or topics that you'd like to discuss. That'll be important because it will help me understand what kind of information you're going to want to know in advance, and also perhaps say to you, I can answer this question, but I can't answer that one, and you need to talk to this person. The times I will be available, you see on the screen, and I'd like you to offer 2 to 3 times that you're available during those hours. It'll be first come, first serve. And I would be very excited to talk with you about what you're interested in doing.
So people can really feel free to email me. Like as of now, I will also be getting in touch with everybody shortly to send you the slides and some additional resources that we've prepared. So you'll at the very least have my email through that to be able to get in touch and request a coaching session. And yeah, so please feel free to do so you know, as soon as possible, and I'll put you in touch with Louise. We're sort of right up against it for time here at 11:31. So maybe we'll just sort of conclude. I don't know if Louise, Christy, Rob, Jason, anybody want to say any final words?
I would say one final word for me is that, you know, the teaching part, and it's a really big avenue, and I love to do it, and I know Jason and Louise love to do it, and so many artists love to do it. But one thing I do find, and it's important, is just that remember that it's, you know, what you do as an artist is what you bring to that, you know, and so as you continue to, you know, do your practice, you know, you will bring more and more to the learning thing. So it's like, I can, sometimes the education thing become very encompassing for me, you know, it's a lot of work and you're kind of fully involved, but I have to remind myself, Rob, you're doing this because you're an artist, you know, you're trying to do artistic things on your own. So I have to remind myself to just, you know, put some focus on that and don't forget about it. That's all. It's just a little comment.
And I'll just say it's wonderful work. I know for myself, it feeds my artistic practice because I get a lot of inspiration from hearing how other people interact and engage with the world and with arts. So if you've just gotten accepted to Culture in Schools, welcome. I'm really excited for you. And I hope that we get to cross paths in person soon.
I would say just try to share your journey as an artist with the students and the teachers, because that's very valuable. You know, the highs and the lows and the ups and downs and struggles of what it's been and will be for you is really important information, because the students are not going to have that sense of what it means to be an artist. So to tell that story is really important.
Yes. Understanding career pathways is actually a part of the Quebec education program that teachers can include as being one of the goals of their project. Understanding what it means to be a self-employed artist is eye-opening for students. Something we didn't emphasize is that, so our profiles on Artists Inspire are there for education and community and any opportunity for you to get work as a teaching artist. And so there is a button. I think all of you who are here today have gone on and activated that you are in Culture in the Schools. So you can be searched for that. And you can send teachers to our website to see your English profile for Culture in the Schools. They won't get your exact workshop write-up that you put on the Culture in the Schools website. You could provide that as a separate document. But we do encourage you to take advantage of the fact that we were able to create this website of artist profiles so that there was an English place that you could be promoting yourself.
So with that, we're sort of a little over time, so we'll probably finish there. As I've mentioned, I'll be in touch with everybody a little bit later today with the slides, with some additional resources. You'll have my email to be able to get in touch with me to request a coaching session with Louise. You'll also have my email if you're interested in learning more about our Quebec Relations resources. You know, if you're interested in applying for some Quebec arts funding in addition to your work in schools, happy to talk about that. Also, as soon as possible, early next week, we're hoping to have an archive recording of this webinar up on our ELAN YouTube. So we'll be able to share that if you'd like to review what we discussed today. And really, once again, I just want to thank Louise, Christy, Rob, and Jason for the wonderful input today. I think this has been so good and so helpful to people, and it's made a huge difference. So thanks to all of you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you very much.
Great job.
My pleasure. And yeah, so stay tuned. We'll have more Quebec Relations and ELAN webinars coming at you soon in the coming months, and you'll hear from me soon. Have a lovely rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.